The Subcommittee on Environment will come to order. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing entitled Mid-Level Ethanol Blends, Consumer and Technical Research Needs. Before we begin, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank my esteemed colleague, Dr. Andy Harris, for his service to the committee and to his leadership as chairman of the Environment Subcommittee. We congratulate him on his appointment to the House Appropriations Committee, but regret the loss of an active member of this committee. We thank him for his leadership and wish him the very best of luck in his new committee assignment. I am Chris Stewart. I'm the vice chairman of this subcommittee. I've been asked to pinch hit for Dr. Harris in his absence, and hopefully we can stumble through this without too many incidents. I appreciate the presence of the witnesses with us today, as well as other members of the subcommittee. In front of you are packets containing the written testimony and the biographies and the truth and testimony disclosures for today's witnesses. Excuse me. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Welcome to this afternoon's hearing on the Environment Subcommittee entitled Mid-Level Ethanol Blends, Consumer and Technical Research Needs. This legislation hearing builds upon the work of this committee pursued last Congress involving technical aspects of the Environmental Protection Agency's approval of mid-level ethanol blends for use in certain vehicles. Relying on a single set of narrow tests, EPA approved fuel with up to 15% ethanol, known as E15, for use in 2001 model year and newer passenger vehicles. Concurrently, and for the first time in the history of the Clean Air Act, EPA conducted a bifurcated fuel system prohibiting E15 use in all other engines and vehicles. Unfortunately, the more E15 is studied, the more concerns are identified. In addition to potential widespread impacts on vehicle engines, EPA has led a haphazard transition E15 usage marked by regulatory confusion, bungled implementation, and a lack of consumer education. Today's hearing is not a forum to discuss whether corn ethanol is good or bad, but rather, it is designed to answer questions like, what have we learned about the effects of E15 since 2010? What types of research would be helpful before there's more widespread use throughout the United States? And finally, what types of research and development should be required ahead of the introduction of new fuels in the future? Toward answering these questions, our witnesses will be commenting on discussion, draft legislation in their packets. This bill would require the EPA contract with National Academy of Sciences to assess the state of science regarding E15, including research needs, gaps in understanding, recent testing, and consumer education efforts. This draft is substantially similar to H.R. 3199, bipartisan legislation co-sponsored by Congressman Sensenbrenner and passed overwhelmingly by the full Science, Space, and Technology Committee last year. That legislation was also endorsed by a diverse coalition of groups concerned about EPA's E15 science, including everyone from the Friends of the Earth and National Turkey Federation to the American Petroleum Institute and Alliance of Automobile Manufacturers. For example, the now president of the Environmental Working Group testified to this subcommittee last Congress that our comprehensive review of the available scientific data indicates that E15 and higher ethanol blends could have significant adverse impacts on human and environmental health. This hearing is focused on technical and consumer concerns about the potential engine damage, warranty issues, and misfueling associated with EPA's approval of bifurcated fueling system. The Clean Air Act does not allow a waiver for new fuel if it would result in the failure of emission standards in cars manufactured after 1974. Recent research has found major problems resulting from the use of mid-level ethanol blends. This research has identified negative impacts to the engine durability, onboard diagnostics, fuel pumps, as well as non-road marine, outdoor power equipment, and snowmobile engines. Additional research has shown that consumers are completely unaware of this dramatic change, a 50% increase in the amount of ethanol per gallon in the fuel they are putting in their vehicles and engines. Earlier this month, the National Marine Manufacturers Association conducted a survey that found of the 17 stations currently registered to sell E15 in a handful of states, 6 of those stations, fully 35%, had failed to label the pumps according to EPA's requirements. Confusion over misfueling has been magnified by the agency's handling of blender pumps and non-approved vehicles. At one point last year, EPA even proposed a completely impractical and unenforceable mandate that all customers would have to buy at least 4 gallons of any E15 blender pump. This is not promising for the widespread adoption of this fuel, especially as the vast majority of vehicles and engines in America are either not approved for the use of E15 or may have their warranties voided by its use. While EPA's Assistant Administrator, Gina McCarthy, was repeatedly stated that the agency is not currently requiring the use of E15, the agency has aggressively supported the renewable fuel standard. The underlying mandate that will undeniably, at some point in the future, have to force fuel ethanol blends to exceed 10%. And to be clear, RFS further guarantees that E15 is just the tip of the iceberg. RFS mandates 16 billion gallons of renewable fuel to be blended for the sale in 2013. Over the next 10 years, this requirement will grow to 36 billion gallons. This policy is looking more and more like a monument of the folly of central planning, energy planning, and has entailed negative environmental outcomes, rising food costs here in the United States and in third world countries, and even outright fraud involving biofuel credits. This absurdity was demonstrated last week when Ms. McCarthy, reportedly expected to be nominated for EPA Administrator, expressed excitement of her personal milestone that the first credit for cellulose ethanol has just been issued. What she failed to mention is that her agency has mandated 8.65 million gallons of this phantom fuel to be paid for by consumers in 2012, even though virtually none existed. To reiterate, this hearing will not examine the RFS, but rather focus on the downstream impacts related to the technical and consumer research needed on the effects of E15 on all engines, as well as explore a potential path forward that is based on science and expert testing, not on politics. As our witnesses today will testify, there is increasing evidence that American consumers may have to pay the price for EPA's cart before the horse approach to E15 science. I'd now like to recognize the ranking member, the gentlewoman from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici, for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Chairman Stewart. Renewable fuel from biomass, specifically corn-based ethanol, is a complex issue. And as this hearing demonstrates, the ethanol content in our nation's fuel supply has been the subject of much debate. In this committee, we often cover policy areas about which there is disagreement in basic ideology and worldview. But when we're faced with issues on which there is agreement, we should recognize that and work toward consensus solutions. For example, the renewable fuels standard was first included in an energy bill that passed the House and the Senate with bipartisan support. That's a statement we don't say frequently enough. One thing that many of us do say frequently is that we need to put this nation on a path toward energy independence. Our reliance on foreign oil causes concerns in every sector. Businesses and consumers worry about constantly fluctuating prices at the pump. Our generals see a strategic disadvantage to relying on resources provided by countries with which we have experienced significant conflict. And many of our constituents rightly worry that continuing our current use of fossil fuels will harm our fragile environment. The renewable fuels standard represents a bipartisan acknowledgement of the role that alternative fuels play in reducing our dependence on foreign oil. From my time in the Oregon legislature, I know well the concerns that some have about blend levels in gasoline, and I know that various states have made exceptions to accommodate these concerns. It makes sense to fully understand the impacts of our renewable policies before requiring consumers to comply. What does not make sense, however, is refusing to address the problem altogether. The blend wall should not be a reason to give up on renewable fuels. It should be a reason to promote technology that will meet the growing supply of renewables. Advanced ethanol, cellulosic biomass, developments in these fields are only going to increase the supply of blended fuels in the market, and these advancements will help us come further toward energy security. This hearing is supposed to examine, among other things, scientific, technical, and consumer impacts of EPA's decision to allow introduction by waiver of E15 in the market, and that's to allow, not to require. And we will also take comments on a draft bill that Mr. Sensenbrenner is circulating that would prevent the EPA from complying with its congressionally mandated responsibilities under the Clean Air Act until additional research is performed on E15. The Department of Energy conducted much of the science that the EPA used in making its waiver decision. Although I agree that the EPA should not base decisions on incomplete information, neither should this committee. I'm concerned that in the hearing charter and in the witness testimony, the main literature that's being used to refute the EPA's science on E15 is being provided by a group that is largely financed by the American Petroleum Institute and several automobile manufacturers. In a committee where science is paramount, I find it perplexing that the scientific studies we are discussing were largely funded by the oil industry, which has an obvious financial stake in the outcome. In this context, it's also worth pointing out at the outset that following the release of the study from the Coordinating Research Council, the Department of Energy did release a response questioning the methodology of the research. Clean and sustainable renewable fuels are already part of our economy. Investing in clean and renewable energy has and will continue to create jobs, reduce our impact on climate change, reduce our reliance on foreign fossil fuels, and strengthen our national security. We should work toward realizing a future of producing homegrown renewable fuels. And to meet that challenge, it is this committee's responsibility to focus on the science and technology that will help get our country on the road to a sustainable energy future. With that, I look forward to all of the witnesses' testimony and to what I hope will be a productive discussion about the scientific and technological implications of alternative fuels. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Thank you, Ms. Bonamici. If there are other members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. At this time, I would like to introduce the witnesses. Our first witness is Mr. Robert L. Darbelnet, the President and CEO of American Automobile Association, known to most of us as AAA. Mr. Darbelnet has become AAA President and CEO in November 1994 after serving 11 years as CEO of the Canadian Automobile Association in Quebec. He currently serves as Chairman of the Global Mobility Alliance and Trustee of the AAA Foundation for Traffic Safety. Our next witness is the Honorable Wayne Allard, Vice President of Government Relations for the American Motorcyclist Association, or AMA. He previously served from 1997 to 2009 as U.S. Senator for the state of Colorado. Senator served as a ranking member of the Interior Subcommittee of the Senate Appropriations Committee. Before that, Senator Allard was a member of the U.S. House of Representatives from 1991 to 1997. And the final witness today is Mr. Mike Leister, a member of the Board of Directors of the Coordinating Research Council. He chairs the American Petroleum Institute's Fuels Subcommittee and is a member of the API Economics Work Group, and belongs to the American Fuels and Petrochemical Manufacturers Fuels Advisory Subcommittee. Mr. Leister has a Master's of Science in Chemical Engineering and a Master's of Business Administration. As our witnesses should know, spoken testimony is limited to 5 minutes each, after which the members of the committee will have 5 minutes to each of them ask questions. I'd now like to recognize Mr. Darbelnet for 5 minutes to present his testimony.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure to be here on behalf of AAA to share our views on this issue. I realize that you and your colleagues often deal with extremely complex questions, but the subject matter before us today is really quite simple, and that is that allowing the sale of E15 at this point in time is premature and irresponsible. In our view, there are 3 prerequisites for the introduction of a new fuel. The first one is adequate testing to ensure that the product that is being brought to market is safe. In this instance, that has not occurred. Granted, the EPA has conducted extensive testing, but the focus of that testing has been on the impact of E15 on emission controls, not on the broader effect of the product on the engine itself. Industry testing reveals true and genuine concerns, and you will hear more about that later this afternoon, but clearly from our research, or our review of the research, I should say, premature engine wear, potential fuel pump failures and a series of other less significant consequences can occur if this fuel is used in vehicles that were manufactured more recently than last year. Even the Renewable Fuel Association advises retailers to beware of the dangers and the damage that can result from putting E15 in underground storage systems. They speak of possible leaks and fires. Clearly, there is something here. The second requirement, in our view, for introducing a new fuel to market is coordination between regulators, fuel retailers, and auto manufacturers. And the record is clear in that that has not occurred. A number of the retailers in this country are opposed to the sale of E15 and at the present time do not intend to bring it to market. Virtually every OEM or auto manufacturer in this country has indicated that using E15 in vehicles that were manufactured more recently than last year, with the exception of Porsche that will tell you that you could use it in a vehicle that is older than that, virtually all of the OEMs have said, do not put this fuel in your tank unless you are accepting of the fact that it will void your warranty. And the third requirement for introducing a new product is outreach to consumers to mitigate the risk of misfueling. And that hasn't occurred either. Again, the record is clear. We conducted research recently that shows that 95% of the motoring public in this country does not know what E15 is, let alone whether they should be putting it in the tank of their vehicle. And to further complicate matters, the EPA ceded to pressures to tone down the message on the warning label, which incidentally is rather small and generally lost in all of the advertising which is on today's fuel pumps. But they agreed to tone down the message on that label from what was initially contemplated and would have started with the word warning to something less significant, in other words, attention. Now, I want to make clear the fact that AAA is not opposed to ethanol for automobiles. E10 is compatible with almost every vehicle on the road today, automobiles, I should say, because you will hear from my colleagues that the same is not true for other types of vehicles. But for automobiles, E10 is safe. Our issue is not with ethanol. We see the benefit of reduced dependency on fossil fuel. We see the benefit of bringing to market alternative options for consumers. However, as I said at the outset, the sale of E15 at this point in time is irresponsible, and it should cease until adequate testing allows regulators, retailers, and auto manufacturers to reconcile their viewpoints, to agree on which vehicles can safely consume E15, and to make sure that the consumer is adequately informed of the risks that follow the use of E15 in today's automobiles. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. I now recognize Senator Allard for 5 minutes for his testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to congratulate you on chairing your first committee.
Thank you. It's really quite exciting.
Acting Chairman Chris Stewart and Ranking Member Suzanne Bonamici, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to provide comment on mid-level ethanol blends, consumer and technical research needs. I was in public office for 26 years, but I still shake my head over the ability of the federal government to reach, or maybe I should say overreach, into the lives of the American people and the power wielded by bureaucrats to do so. One case in point is E15, a gasoline formulation that contains up to 15% ethanol by volume, which could damage motorcycle and all-terrain vehicle engines. The American Motorcyclist Association believes extensive, independent testing needs to be done before E15 becomes more widely available. The key for the AMA and our members is that E15 must be proven safe for motorcycle and ATV engines. To the best of our knowledge, E15 is not approved for use in any original equipment motorcycles or ATVs. In fact, its use can void many manufacturers' warranties. As of today, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has only approved the use of E15 in model year 2001 and newer cars, light-duty trucks, and medium-duty passenger vehicles. This list does not include motorcycles or ATVs. How is the federal government going to prevent motorcyclists from inadvertently putting E15 in their gas tanks or gas cans when getting gas at a blender pump with a single hose? Here's where the EPA overreached. Initially, the EPA decided that you must buy at least 4 gallons of gas from that blender pump. Not 1 gallon, not 2 gallons, not 3 gallons. Yes, the government mandated you buy at least 4 gallons to dilute the residual E15 in the hose. The EPA revealed the 4-gallon minimum mandate to the AMA in a letter last August responding to AMA concerns that E15 could be put in motorcycle and ATV gas tanks inadvertently when consumers use blender pumps. Unlike an automobile or SUV that has a large fuel tank, the residual fuel left in a fueling hose could be detrimental to the performance of motorcycle or ATV engines due to the small size of their fuel tanks and the higher concentration of ethanol that would therefore be present in the fuel. In addition, the use of E15 will lower fuel efficiency and possibly cause premature engine failure. In off-road engines, the effect can even be dangerous for users. Another problem with that new EPA policy is that not all motorcycle and ATV gas tanks hold 4 gallons or more gallons. Not only did we find it unacceptable for the EPA to mandate that everyone, including our members, buy minimum amounts of gas, but that the EPA answer simply would not work because of the sizes of many motorcycle and ATV gas tanks, and the fact that off-highway riders take containers of gas with them on their trips. Most times, these containers are much smaller than 4 gallons. We stressed that the EPA needed to come up with a better solution. So on February 7th, in response to concerns expressed by the AMA and power equipment makers, the EPA issued new guidelines to help ensure that motorcyclists and others don't inadvertently use E15 fuel. Under the new option, retailers who use a blender pump to sell E15 and E10 fuel through the same hose must also have a separate E10, E0 fuel pump. Those retailers would be required to have a label on the blender pump that reads, "Passenger vehicles only, used in other vehicles, engines, and equipment may violate federal law." Retailers would also be required to have signs indicating the location of the dedicated E10 or lower fuel pump. There would be no minimum fuel purchase requirement at that pump. Now, we can only imagine how many motorists and motorcyclists will be lining up at that single pump to get E10 or lower fuel. Retailers who want to sell E15 also have the option of having a dedicated E15 pump or hose, or a pump that dispenses E15 and higher ethanol blends through a single hose. If a blender pump dispenses multiple fuels that include E15 and higher ethanol blends, the EPA may require a minimum purchase requirement. The AMA has repeatedly expressed concerns to government officials and federal lawmakers about possible damage to motorcycle and ATV engines caused by the inadvertent use of E15 when the new fuel becomes widely available. The AMA has also asked that motorcycles and ATVs be part of any scientific study into the effects of E15 to ensure that the new fuel blend would not damage those engines. It's my sincere hope that this subcommittee continues to be proactive on this important issue affecting motorcyclists and ATV riders. The AMA and its members stand ready to serve as a resource for you and your staff as you further deliberate making our nation's fuel supply safer for all users. Again, I wish to thank the chairman, the ranking member, and the subcommittee for holding this legislative hearing on E15.
Thank you, Senator. On a personal note, I'll note that your home state of Colorado is almost as beautiful as my home state of Utah, and I look forward to joining you on your next motorcycle ride through the West. I now recognize Mr. Leister for his testimony.
And thank you, neighbor.
Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me here today to testify on mid-level ethanol research programs conducted by the Coordination Research Council, CRC. I'm a senior fuels policy advisor for Marathon Petroleum Corporation, but today I'm here to represent CRC. I'm currently a member of the CRC Board of Directors, and I am a past president of the board. CRC is a research organization that has been around for more than 70 years. You may not have heard of it much before, but it has done significant research throughout the two world wars and since then. About 2/3 of the CRC budget is paid for by automobile manufacturers and the American Petroleum Institute. The remaining funding is paid for on a project-by-project basis by outside organizations. CRC is the gold standard of vehicle and fuels research. In recent years, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the U.S. Department of Energy, the California Air Board, the National Renewable Energy Lab, and even the Renewable Fuels Association and Growth Energy have contributed significant funds to CRC research projects. I'd like to stress on the outset that my testimony for CRC does not engage in any advocacy. CRC stays out of advocacy. We try to conduct straightforward research and report the facts that have been learned. CRC leaves it to other parties to apply political interpretation to these results. My written testimony has some additional background on CRC. Shortly after the enactment of the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007, the auto, oil industries, and even DOE and EPA recognized that substantial research was needed to assess the compatibility of higher-level ethanol blends with existing vehicles and small engines. The Coordinating Research Council developed and funded a comprehensive multi-year testing program. In the early stages of this program, DOE and NREL participated in the design of various projects and even helped write some of the preliminary reports. The CRC has spent close to $14 million looking at mid-level ethanol blends research over the past years, and we're committed to finishing the projects that we have underway. Attachment 1 in my testimony lists the CRC programs and their schedules. The chief programs in this area are, first of all, the durability of the engine itself, particularly engine valves and valve seats. That program's been completed. The durability of the vehicle onboard fuel storage and handling equipment. That project has also been completed. The computerized onboard diagnostic system, or OBD, which the driver often sees as the check engine light coming on and off. That project is still ongoing. And finally, the last major part of our research has been the vehicle evaporative emissions control system, which minimizes the release of fuel vapors to the atmosphere, and that project has been completed. This comprehensive set of test programs will be completed this spring with the OBD program being completed. However, the test results on at least 2 of the programs, the engine durability and the fuel system durability, suggest that E15 has the potential to damage millions of vehicles in the current U.S. fleet. CRC, along with EPA and DOE, participated in all 8 of the mid-level ethanol stakeholder meetings that have been held since May of 2008. On each occasion, we shared our research schedule and preliminary test results. However, EPA chose to ignore this research. Instead of waiting for CRC studies to be completed and thoroughly evaluated, EPA improperly used data from a DOE catalyst durability program and drew conclusions about E15 effects, which the DOE program was simply not designed to evaluate. My testimony today will highlight the results of the CRC E15 research on engine durability and fuel system durability. On engine durability, the research demonstrated that E15 and E20 could cause engine damage, specifically excess valve and seat wear, under certain driving conditions in some of the existing vehicles that were expected to be sensitive to ethanol concentrations. 2 out of 8 models tested in the program failed on E15 and E20, but not on E0. The failures that occurred were compression failures, and they can result in the loss of power, increased emissions, and high repair costs for the consumer. On fuel system durability, the research identified an elevated incidence of fuel pump failures, fuel system component swelling, impairment of the fuel level measurements in some of the vehicles tested. E15 can cause erratic and misleading fuel gauge readings and cause improper check engine light illuminations. Fuel pump failures will stop the flow of fuel to the engine, which can result in breakdowns on the highway or busy streets. A fuel system components problems did not develop when CRC tested E10 or E0 on these components. Discovering these problems was not really very surprising because valve and valve seat upgrades are typically what an auto manufacturer does to make a vehicle E85 compatible. Fuel pumps and level sender problems are also not surprising because these components also are typically upgraded to make flex fuel vehicles for E85. I'd like to point out that CRC only tested a small sample of vehicles, engines, and components in the current U.S. vehicle fleet, and that most of the sampled vehicles, engines, and components demonstrated no problem with E15. However, the problems uncovered represent serious concerns over the useful life of millions of the vehicles in the current fleet. Until 2012, no vehicles in the U.S. fleet, except for flex fuel vehicles, were really designed to handle E15, so it's not surprising these problems were found. CRC simply believes that the research demonstrates that millions of the vehicles, engines, or components in the U.S. fleet could be damaged by E15. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the three of you for your sacrifice and your service in making yourselves available to us today for your questions and your expertise. Reminding the members that the committee rules limit questioning to 5 minutes. The chair at this point would open the round of questioning, and the chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. A concern that I think many of us have, and this is bipartisan, it's something that I think is unanimous throughout leadership in government, and that is the risk of unfunded mandates from the federal government, where rules or regulations may be imposed without authorizing any funds to offset the actual cost of those rules or regulations. And I think this may be a potentially good example of that. And again, it would be bipartisan if that were the case. If we were to start receiving calls from our constituents who had significant damage to what would, for them, many of them, be one of the largest investments they'll make in that, short of a home or some others, the automobile that they drive. And if they did receive damage from that because of these rules, my question to you is, who is liable if the consumer were to experience engine damage because of the use of the E15 approval in the engines? And I think you've answered the question, but if you feel like you would elaborate, what is the likelihood of that happening? And what would you do to recommend that we avoid that situation? And maybe, Mr. Darbelnet, we could begin with you.
Certainly. Thank you for that question. Thank you for that question. Clearly, the liability that would result from that occurring should not rest with the consumer. At the same time, none of the other parties that seem to have an interest in making E15 available are willing to step forward and assume liability. In fact, there have been efforts on their part to avoid liability, which I think is an indication of their recognition that there is an issue here that needs to be dealt with. I think we should also observe that the damage that we are concerned about is probably going to occur over a period of time. And so we will not immediately discover the full magnitude of the problem, and by the time it is apparent, I suspect it's going to be difficult to trace back the provenance of the fuel that may have led to the damage, because if you've been driving for a year or two and using this fuel and you have damage, was it when you bought it at service station A, or when you bought it at service station B or service station C? So really what we need to do is to adequately test it before we make it available for sale. That's the solution.
Well, I just have to interject. I'm just shocked that no one is stepping forward to claim responsibility for this potential liability. But of course they wouldn't. And like you said, it's ambiguous and difficult to determine in some cases. Would either of the two of you like to address the same question?
Mr. Chairman, I would just comment that we don't recommend to our members that they purchase a motorcycle that's not covered by a manufacturer's warranty. And when these aren't covered by warranty, in all clear conscience, we can't recommend that they buy that fuel or buy that engine or whatever. So those warranties are put out there to protect the consumer and any liability that they may assume.
You know, I would just hope that the legislation considers the impacts of that and that we don't leave our constituents with a significant liability that they have no means of controlling. Yes. Mr. Leister, would you like to address that question as well?
I think Mr. Darby.
Let me ask just very quickly, if we have time for this. So why is the testing of the Coordinated Research Council conducted better or more appropriate than the EPA relied on? Are there differences in the underlying studies? Yes.
You appear to be looking at me, but I might want to defer the question to someone else. However, I would offer that we haven't really challenged the EPA research on the basis of did they spend enough time looking at the effect of the fuel. Our concern with their research is the scope. It's my understanding that what they were looking at was the effect of E15 on emission control systems. They did not address the effect of E15 on the other components of the engine that were discussed by one of the previous testimonies.
Basically, the EPA testing was an attempt to try to figure out whether E15 was a problem in vehicles. There was a vast lack of knowledge in this area. The fact that they chose to maybe not run as strenuous a test as necessary doesn't degrade from the fact they did a test, but it really wasn't designed to test the whole vehicle, as Mr. Darbonet just discussed. The CRC program was actually designed by the auto manufacturers, and the tests were what auto manufacturers would use to test their own equipment before they sell it to the public. And as that, it had a higher standard than EPA developed for their tests.
All right, thank you. I now recognize Ms. Bonamici for 5 minutes for her question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses. Before I begin my questioning, I just wanted to say a word about the witnesses in the hearing record. Because the Department of Energy conducted the research on which the EPA based its decision to grant the E15 waivers, it's important to note for the record that the majority invited neither the Department of Energy nor the EPA to discuss the science and extensive testing on which the EPA based its decision. In addition, since the Department of Energy released a critique of this study performed by the Coordinating Research Council, the group that Mr. Leister is here representing, this conversation would have benefited from a Department of Energy presence on the panel. Unfortunately, the Democratic Subcommittee staff got word of Mr. Leister's appearance at this hearing at such a late hour that inviting the department wasn't an option for us. So accordingly, I'm planning to submit various materials for the record that help to represent an alternative viewpoint in this debate. Although they don't necessarily represent the views of all of the Democrats on this committee, it should help bring some balance to the record. I wanted to ask, just to establish for the record, and I think Mr. Darbonet, perhaps you would have the answer to this, do you know how many gas stations there are in the United States?
I don't know the exact number, but there are thousands and thousands and thousands. Probably, let's say 100,000 or more.
About 100,000.
169,000.
Thank you, Mr. Leister. Do you know how many of them are selling E15?
My understanding is that there might be somewhere between 10 and 20. The number I heard most recently was 18 that are currently selling it, which is precisely why we think this ought to be addressed now. It's going to be easy to stop when it's only 18. It will be difficult to stop when it's 100,000.
Thank you. I just think it's important to establish for the record that we're talking about somewhere around a dozen and a half out of hundreds of thousands, so just for the record. And Mr. Darbonet, I know that the AAA, of which I'm a proud member, is an organization focused on benefits of membership, peace of mind on the road, money saver, and that's I think something that we all appreciate. I'm sure that you hear frequently from your members, as I do from my constituents, about the high price of gasoline. And I know that studies have shown that drivers can save up to 83 cents per gallon because of increased ethanol production. So I just wonder about motorists who drive cars that even manufacturers say can use E15. Should they be allowed the option of buying E15? And setting aside the uniqueness of places like Oregon and New Jersey where we are not allowed to pump our own gas. It's very quaint, but that puts it in a different situation.
Thank you for that question and for your support of AAA as a member. With regard to the potential savings per gallon, the numbers that I have seen are far less than 83 cents per gallon. There may be some unique circumstances that you're aware of that would cause the differential to be of that magnitude, but the indications we have are that if it's not price parity, the savings is quite modest. And if one factors in the lesser miles per gallon traveled with E15 than with E10 or pure gasoline, the savings is then reduced because you're not getting as many miles per gallon for the gallon that you bought. However, clearly we are in favor of options for consumers. Our concern currently is not that E15 should never be brought to market. Our concern is that the consumers do not know whether they should put E15 in their vehicle or not, and there is a huge difference of opinion between the EPA that says you can use it in any vehicle manufactured after 2001 and the people who actually make the cars who say that it shouldn't be used in virtually 95% of the vehicles that are on the roads today. And it seems to me that with your assistance, we owe it to the traveling public to reconcile viewpoints from the auto manufacturers and the EPA so the consumer is not caught in the middle not knowing who to believe.
Thank you. And I truly believe also in consumer education. I want to ask Mr. Leister while we have time. When the Coordinating Research Council put out this study on the automobile impact of E15, the Department of Energy did point out some problems that they found with the research. I know the Department of Energy's Vehicle Technologies program presented an analysis that concluded that the methodologies were significantly flawed in their words. It's my understanding, for example, that no engines were tested with E10, which represents more than 90% of the gas in the United States, and at least one of the tested automobiles was already the subject of a recall involving valve problems. So can you describe to us how the CRC study compared in terms of scope with the Department of Energy testing? For example, the number of vehicles and number of miles driven, and did the Energy Department's critique cause you to revisit your methodology?
Certainly the Energy Department's critique caused us to relook at our program, and API has issued a letter that you can reference. I believe it was sent to the committee here, outlining various rebuttals there. CRC would just stick to the facts here. DOE decided to do basically a catalyst emissions test. They ran the vehicles to get the catalyst hot enough to give them the equivalent life over the life of the vehicle. That is not a very strenuous test, and it's not even the way the average public drives their car. CRC, because there's no standard test for engine durability, took the advice of the various auto manufacturers that are members of CRC and developed a composite test based on their experience. And those tests did show some compression leakage. But more important than that, the compression leakage that we determined wasn't the final result. The compression leakage was a signal for us to send the vehicles back to the manufacturers. So each manufacturer got their own vehicle back, tore it apart, and looked at it. And it was only 2 out of the 8 that actually had a problem with the valve seats. As far as the vehicles being under a recall, I am not aware that any of the vehicles we tested were under a recall for a valve problem.
Thank you, and my time has expired. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you. I think the ranking minority member, Ms. Bonamici. The chair would like to note for the record that the minority had the opportunity to invite any witnesses of their choosing, but chose not to at this time. And that, I think, would help explain some of the choice or the appearances of the witnesses with us today. The chair now recognizes Mr. Sensenbrenner for his questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. And Mr. Chairman, I'm glad that you pointed out that the Democrats did have a chance to invite a witness, and they failed to do so. So the complaint that we heard from the ranking member, I think, rings very hollow. You know, the other thing that really irritates me is casting aspersions on research that is done because it's financed by somebody who may have a party in interest. The thing is that I think that anybody who sells a product wants to make sure that their product is the absolute best that it can be. And maybe part of the motivation of that is to avoid liability problems. But I think part of the motivation is to keep America's edge in terms of developing new products, whether it happens to be a fuel, whether it happens to be a motor vehicle. And who is supposed to do that if those that manufacture or sell the products don't do it? I don't think the government can come up with something that is objective. And here what we've heard from all three of these witnesses is that the only thing the EPA tested was the impact of E15 on emission systems, not on the engine itself, not on the component parts of the engine. And as a result, the thing that the opponents of this waiver have been harping on is that the study was really not complete. You know, it was kind of, you know, trying to diagnose a skin cancer by doing a CAT scan or an MRI. Now, you know, having said that, the draft bill that I have, which I hope my minority party colleagues will co-sponsor, will have a truly objective analysis being done by the National Association of Sciences, so that nobody can say that the study was done by somebody with a financial interest or was biased because they wanted to advance a regulatory agenda. Now, I have a couple of questions of Mr. Leister. Why did the CRC move forward with its studies if E15 was already approved for use?
Well, actually, we started our studies long before the waiver request was even made. We started our studies in 2008. That's why we actually tested E20 and E15. At the time we started, we were not aware that E15 was going to be the fuel choice of EPA.
Was the EPA's response to your studies objective, and were their results fairly analyzed from an unbiased scientific viewpoint, or was basically the EPA saying that everybody should ignore what you've done?
You make it difficult because EPA actually pays for some of our projects. We'd hate to lose that funding.
Well, we won't talk about conflicts of interest here then. So,
you know, EPA did their analysis, and it appeared that they were under a tremendous amount of pressure to come up with some answers. And as a result, the more we informed them that there was more research to be done and more timely, the less interested they were in hearing about that. I might point out that the research that was done, you correctly pointed out that our members do this to find out what is happening, you know, and what our problems are. Two of the members of CRC, the auto members, have used that research to actually now make E15 compatible vehicles. One that has made vehicles in 2012 and 2013 that are E15 compatible, and one has started in 2013 to make vehicles that are E15 compatible. I think that one says volumes for the fact they say the ones, any other vehicles they made prior to that, they won't warranty with E15, and yet they are making ones that will. And secondly, that they have seen what the problems were based on the research, and they've fixed those problems.
I'd like to squeeze in one more question of Senator Allard. There are safety concerns as well as the other concerns that have been expressed by the witnesses at the hearing. For example, the Coast Guard told the EPA that a waiver raised concerns relating to possible reduction in level of safety for recreational boaters. So we've got the recreational boaters. And at least in my part of the country, and maybe yours too, Senator Allard, we got snow blowers because everybody would get marooned if the snow blowers didn't work. And then during the summer, we have lawnmowers. All of these small engines have the same problems with E15, and many of them are two-cycle engines where the increased ethanol would end up reducing the lubricating capacity of the oil that has to be mixed in with the engines. What do you have to say about that? And, you know, can you broaden the complaint with the other small engines that I've mentioned?
Well, I'm not an engineer and probably can't answer that very directly, but I can say that there's concern among motorcyclists about the heat that's generated and the safety of that engine when they're riding their motorcycle.
Okay. I'll rest my case on the Coast Guard then. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sensenbrenner. Seeing not another individual to my right, we will now yield down to Mr. Weber.
Well, I really don't have a lot of questions, Chris. I appreciate that. I will note for the record that unlike New Jersey and Texas, we can pump our own gas. I figure that in Texas, we understand that consumers and businesses get it right a lot more often than in Congress. I applaud you all for testifying. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you then. And Mr. Rohrabacher.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate your leadership and coming right out of the gate this way.
Thank you.
Straight at an important issue. This is an important issue, and I'll tell you something. Out in California, nobody can tell me that I'm not getting less gas mileage because of that ethanol. And quite frankly, people think we congressmen are rich. Well, I'm not rich, and it affects me. And what about those people who don't make as much as those of us in Congress? You increase the cost of filling up your tank. That just means you don't have as much money to pay rent or feed your kids or take your family out for a dinner. So ethanol was first in place, and you're the experts here. Wasn't it first put in place, this mandate for ethanol to get rid of the lead in gasoline? Is that right? No. Why did we have the mandate to begin with?
The original ethanol mandate, I believe, started from a program EPA had to reduce carbon monoxide in certain cities that were in non-attainment of the carbon monoxide standard. I believe it was back in 91, 92 timeframe. There were a handful of cities that had carbon monoxide problems. There had been some splash blending of ethanol for economic purposes prior to that, but the actual regulation of ethanol was first put into place.
For carbon monoxide. Did that lower the level of carbon monoxide?
Yes. At the time, the engine technology at the time with carbureted vehicles and that, getting extra oxygen from the ethanol actually did help reduce carbon monoxide. Since that time, the new engines now automatically adjust. They sense the oxygen coming out of the exhaust and adjust the intake air. So you'd no longer get that benefit from vehicles today. But it was a benefit back in the early.
So, in other words, we put this requirement in to lower the carbon monoxide, but because engine technology is advanced, that would be no longer necessary today. Is that what you're saying?
That's true, but even more important than that, I guess, is that all the areas that were in carbon monoxide non-attainment, except for maybe one, I believe, have all come into attainment. They all came into attainment real fast, even as engine technology was changing.
Is that true with motorcycles too, Senator?
Well, if you'll recall, when about the time I was in the House serving with you, the issue was oxygenated fuels.
That's right.
And we had the MTBE versus ethanol. And that was a big debate, and it was to reduce the air pollution.
And was the air pollution level, and would it be better today or worse today if we didn't have ethanol in the gas? What I just heard there, it sounded like you were saying that even without ethanol in the gas, the air pollution level would not be any worse today.
Well, you got to understand there are a lot of things we try to control in the air, not just carbon monoxide. The other major one is ozone, okay?
Right.
And ozone comes about because of NOx emissions and volatile organic compounds, or VOC emissions. In 1995, reformulated gasoline was legislated and regulated by EPA. That fuel is both lower in VOCs and lower in NOx, and so it's used in areas that have a problem with attaining the ozone standard. And it has helped, but in the interim, all the other gasoline in the country, because of various other EPA regulations, has become a lot cleaner.
Well, is there anything else? I mean, is there another impact? For example, particulates, or
there's a particulate problem also.
Doesn't the ethanol contribute to that rather than helping bring that down?
It's difficult to say. I say there's some studies that show that particulates are reduced with oxygen, the extra oxygen that's present. Under newer vehicles, that effect isn't quite as large. And so there are some studies that show that particulates have actually gone up as a result of that, I believe.
Okay, well, I think there are some
it's
studies
really
like
slight,
that.
okay?
But let me just note this, that if you're bringing down the miles per gallon that you're getting in your car, which ethanol does, I mean, I'll sit over there and testify to that. So you're bringing it, that means you have to use more gas. If you have to use more gas, that means to get to the same place, that means you have more, you're putting more stuff into the air.
You are, but the Tier 2 standards.
But if you have to use more of it, that means you got the same amount of stuff going up.
But the Tier 2 standards that EPA put in place in 2007 basically required engines and fuels to be 90%, have 90% less emissions than they had before. That overwhelms most of these other effects that you're talking about.
90% based on the same miles per gallon, perhaps.
No, it's actually it's on a per mile basis. So it builds in the miles per gallon factor.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Just let me note that in California, we aren't, at least those of us who are filling up our tanks with gas and we drive a lot out there, we definitely believe that ethanol is costing us and costing American families a lot of money. And I am not so sure that it's worth exactly what we're paying for. And Mr. Senator Aller, one last thing. Did you say this is going to hurt the engines for motorcycles?
Congressman, that is a concern that we have because the manufacturer won't issue a warranty when you use E15 in the engine. So we think there's a reason for that, and we wouldn't recommend it to our consumers.
Yeah, we're afraid of that too, and that also is a factor in determining what the pollution level is. If you're going to destroy an engine, that means in the end there's a lot more factor stuff going into the air when you add in all of that. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher. We now recognize the full committee chairman, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, let me say I regret missing the witnesses' testimony today, but appreciate all of them being here. And Senator Allard, nice to see you again and welcome back. What I'm trying to do is, in my own mind, and I think this will be helpful to all of us and helpful to others as well, is sort of compiling a list of advantages and disadvantages of E15. And what I'd like to do is give you my list on both sides and ask you all to comment to see if you agree or disagree, or if you can add anything to either side of the ledger. On the disadvantages, we have unknown impact of E15 on various types of engines. We've had a study about emissions. We haven't had any real study on the impact of the engines themselves. Second, you get about 30% less gas mileage if you use E15. That might be a disadvantage. Environment, you can probably argue that either way, but the amount of energy, probably fossil fuel energy, that goes into growing the corn necessary for ethanol is obviously not a positive impact on the environment. And then fourth, I would put, well, maybe those are my three. I was going to say, talk about more of the harms to engines, but I think my first point covers them. On the other side, as far as advantages go, price of gasoline is going to be less costly. I'd put that as a positive. And then again, on the environment, you can probably argue either way. There's less CO2 going into the environment, but I've already mentioned the other side of that. What do you all think of that list of advantages and disadvantages? And Darbalnet, I guess, Dr. Darbalnet, we'll start with you.
Thank you. Well, with regard to impact on the engine, clearly that is one of our concerns, and I think you're correct to have that on your list of negatives. With regard to getting less miles per gallon, I would agree it will yield less miles per gallon, but I think the differential is much smaller than 30%. Pure gas would be the benchmark. E10 would probably get you slightly less than 4% worse gas mileage.
Okay, figure I heard was actually 33% less.
No,
you think that's too much?
From everything I've seen, it's between 4 and 6% less, depending on whether you're using E10 or E15.
Okay.
And as to the impact on corn, I'm well over the tip of my skis on that topic. But with regard to the positives, less costly, yes, slightly, but one has to bear in mind that you're getting less miles per gallon. And with regard to the environmental impact, from our conversations with our engineers, they think that overall it is pretty close to being a wash. So really the only outstanding issue for us at this point is the matter of impact on engines, and I think we should note in the pluses the reduced dependency on fossil fuel that results from using ethanol as an additive.
Okay, environment you would call a wash, less mileage, less cost, and unknown impact on engines, or negative impact.
Negative impact.
So overall, negative, I guess. Senator Allard, and by the way, I'm just curious, if the mileage is down 6%, is the cost going to be down 6% or not?
Well, that is part of the conversation. The cost is less. Is it 6%? Sometimes it is 6%. Sometimes it's a little more. Sometimes it's a little bit less.
We're coming up with another wash there.
We are coming very close to a wash. I think the big issue is the impact on the engine.
Great. Senator Allard.
Yeah. Congressman, I think the big concern that we'd have is confusion at the gas tank. You know, with the rules and regulations that are at the gas tank that's being imposed upon the retailer. You know, I think that's a concern that we have, and then because of that confusion, you put the wrong kind of fuel in your engine, in which the warranty will stand up with. Also, motorcyclists are concerned about the fact that if E15 is used in a rural gas station, for example, and you're out in a rural area and you run out of gas, you don't have much choice. And so it takes away consumer choice in some instances.
As well. Okay, thank you. And Mr. Lester.
Again, I'm talking for CRC, so I'm going to just try to stick with scientific facts rather than opinions and political facts. But definitely we're concerned about the impacts on the vehicles, the engines, and the components with E15. We think millions of vehicles will be affected, so it's a bad choice for the public. As far as fuel economy, ethanol is 30% less energy than gasoline. When it's blended at a 10% rate, the E10 mixture has a 3% less fuel economy. E15 would have 4.5% using just straight multiplication there. And as far as energy and corn, there are a lot of studies. California found that corn wasn't necessarily so good for the environment, but then they changed their mind. EPA found that corn was. A lot of this has to do with the way you account for the energy that goes into the distiller's dried grain. However, if you're strictly looking at fossil energy going to something to give you energy to move a transportation vehicle, there's more energy of fossil fuel that goes into making ethanol than you get energy out of the ethanol. Okay, but when you add the distiller's dried grain in, the net result overall is positive. So if you have a program where you're trying to produce feed for animals, you might want to think about it.
Okay. Did you comment on engines? Did you say it would be a negative?
Yes.
Okay. So there's general agreement among all the witnesses on negative impact or potential negative impact on engines then. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. The ranking minority member has requested follow-up question. We now recognize Ms. Bonamici.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm holding up the whole side of the dais today. I wanted to talk a little bit about the misfueling that I know several of you have mentioned. Misfueling would be a real concern, but it's not an unprecedented issue. Similar problems were anticipated when unleaded fuel was introduced. And more recently, there were concerns about the ultra-low sulfur diesel that would result in widespread misfueling, as well as infrastructure challenges. For a couple of years, there were two types of diesel in the fuel supply, low sulfur diesel and the ultra-low sulfur. Did the AMA or the AAA notice any significant misfueling issues? And was the fuel industry generally able to meet the challenge? And maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the consumer information that went into informing gasoline consumers about those issues. And Senator Allard and Mr. Darboulnay, perhaps? So I don't know if Mr. Leister, you want to opine on that as well. Thank you.
Well, those, if I might respond, on the misfueling issues, I guess you would say the 4-gallon, when they required the 4-gallon minimum, that's a problem for us because many times the tanks only hold 3 to 3.5 gallons. So the question came up then, what do you do with the remaining fuels? And are you going to be charged for the 4 full gallons if you don't use it? So that's where confusion at the pump existed when we had that mandate. Now
that was only for the
EPA has tried
prices.
to correct that, and the EPA has tried to correct that, right. And they have now, as we understand it, you do have a choice on blender pumps. As long as you have a dedicated pump just for 10 to 0 on your ethanol levels. And then or you can just have single hoses and you don't have an issue and you don't have the minimum. And so it's very confusing, by the time you consider all the rules and regulations. And it's confusing to our consumers, and it's hard to make wise choices as a consumer when it gets confusing.
Thank you, Senator. And I'm interested, too, in hearing about some of the efforts that have been made in the past about different fueling options and informing consumers. How has the industry gone about informing consumers when there were other concerns about misfueling?
Well, it's an excellent question, and it reminds me of the transition that we encountered when we went to unleaded fuel, which you referred to. As you may recall, at that time they changed the size of the hole through which the gas is put into the vehicle, and we changed the size of the filler spout on the pumps such that you could not fit the nozzle from an unleaded pump into the tank of a vehicle that wasn't designed to receive it. So unless you were going to use a funnel to fill your car, there was virtually no risk of putting unleaded fuel in a vehicle that should have leaded fuel. There's no discussion currently of anything of that nature being done to prevent misfueling as it relates to E15, and frankly I think there's a limit to how many different sizes we can come up with to address the problem. So I think the misfueling risk is more significant in this case than it has been in the past, simply because we don't have some of the options available that we did previously.
And yet, Mr. Leisner, and if you could just clarify, I recall that you testified that there are manufacturers now who are manufacturing cars that are made for E15. Is that correct?
Yes, I'll answer that first, and I'd like to get back to the previous question. But yes, there are 2 manufacturers that I'm aware of that have announced, one that its 2012 and 2013 cars are E15 compatible, and I believe their owner's manuals now state that, and one that is done the same thing for their 2013 vehicles.
Okay, so there have been adaptations. And then
there have been
adaptations to the prior.
I guess I would like to point out that for unleaded gasoline, there was a nozzle change, but also from our point of view, there was, we believe, significant cheating, as people could buy for 5 or 10 cents a little plastic adapter called an emergency fuel system, where you could plug it on the end of the nozzle and make it smaller to fit into the old hole. So if you give people sufficient incentive, they will try to go for the lower fuel, whether it's good for their car or not.
interesting commentary, I think. Well, thank you very much. I yield back my time. Thank you,
Okay,
Mr.
thank
Chairman.
you. Thank you, Ms. Bonamici. Knowing that we need it on the House floor for a vote in just a few moments, the Chair would like to recognize Mr. Nagenbauer.
Yeah, well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. This is a very important issue. This will be a quick question because we need to go vote. But, what some of the proponents of E15 and ethanol bring up the point that in other countries they burn 50, 60%, and some vehicles are burning almost complete 100% ethanol. So what is the distinction here of U.S. moving to the ethanol blending versus what people would point to other countries using that? What's the difference?
Most of the time, people reference Brazil when they're talking about that. And the fact is that I think most of my auto manufacturer colleagues would tell you that the vehicles that they sell in Brazil today are essentially FFVs. So they're designed to take higher levels. They're not U.S. vehicles that are shipped down there. I would like to point out, in the early days of the program in Brazil, the ethanol ate the cars apart. And so they had to replace them with FFVs.
Either one of you want to comment on that?
I would simply concur with what was offered in terms of a commentary.
So I think the conclusion I'm drawing from listening to the testimony today is that there is a movement to provide in the automobile industry an adaptation to that. But what you're saying is it's not mature enough at this particular point in time, and that if we force that process, that we could be actually damaging the consumers that own vehicles.
That is correct, sir. If one thinks about how many new vehicles enter the fleet each year and the average age of the fleet, it's going to take probably a decade to get to a point where a substantial majority of vehicles would be suitable for E15, unless there is some other discovery or retrofit that becomes available or some further ingredient that can negate the effect. But at the present time, there's roughly just 5% of the vehicles on the road that could safely burn E15.
So nobody's come up with an additive or something like that helps transit. So Senator Eller, good to see you again. So what should be the appropriate policy on this issue? You're an old policymaker. What would you recommend to this committee?
Well, I would withhold putting E15 on the market until the research has been conducted that would assure that motorcyclists, in this particular instance, since I represent the AMA, can use it without damage to the engine. To me, that's the proper policies to have the right research, and it hasn't been done at this point, at least for the type of vehicle that I'm representing at this table.
And we're really not, I mean, you bring up motorcycles and we've been talking about automobiles, but we're really actually talking about a lot of other products that
yes,
use fuels that we need to.
Well, I think you can generalize and say small engines in general.
Right. Mm-hmm. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Nagenbauer. With that, we come to the conclusion of this hearing. I'd like to thank the witnesses for your valuable testimony, as well as to the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have additional questions. If that's the case, and we would ask you to respond to those in writing. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional comments and written questions from the members. The witnesses are excused with our thanks, and this hearing is now adjourned.